Welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you've been with us for this series, you know that the story we're exploring is, well, it's much bigger than just its individual parts.
It really is.
We're not just talking about a single broken relationship here or, a bad decision. This is about a documented, methodical, and frankly, a pretty chilling pattern.
Exactly, a pattern. That's the crucial word for today's deep dive. Because what we're looking at is the convergence point for everything we've talked about before.
So maybe we should do a quick recap. We started with dismantling Dirty Daniel, where we first introduced Daniel Martin. We looked at the charm, the constant financial chaos, the manipulation.
Right, the core elements of his whole approach. And from there, we widened the lens in Dirty Daniel, Nashville's own Dirty John.
Where we compared his tactics, that love bombing, the incredibly fast intimacy, the financial stuff, the shifting identities. We put it right alongside the playbook of other infamous manipulators.
And then we went even broader into the psychology of it all with the narcissist blueprint. We mapped out that cycle, the grooming, the idealization, then the devaluation and the discard.
And Daniel's behavior just fit that template with this almost clinical accuracy. It was disturbing to see.
It was. And that brought us to Jessica's side of the story. In our last deep dive, we really focused on her intuition, her strength, and that incredible foresight to start documenting everything.
And the quiet decision she made, really, to choose herself.
Exactly. Which brings us to today, and this is the central point of the entire series. Our mission now is to look at Jessica's journey not just as a story of survival, but as a roadmap, an active, strategic, a blueprint, really.
A blueprint for other survivors, or for people who might be in that situation right now, looking for an exit, looking for justice.
Yes. The focus now is entirely on the movement that grew out of her refusal to stay silent.
This is a deep dive into how one person's commitment to truth, to documentation, and to community could create a force strong enough to finally bring consequences to a serial abuser. So let's get into the exact moment that blueprint started to come together.
Let's do it.
Okay, so the very beginning of this, the point where Jessica's reality really starts to crack, we can actually date it. It was May 17th, 2021.
Yeah, and this is long before any of the public stuff, before the arrests, before there was any kind of coalition. It started so quietly.
It started, like these things so often do, with a single message from a stranger.
And we have to sit with that for a moment because it really exposes the fundamental weakness in any abuser's playbook, which is isolation.
Right. They need you to feel like you're the only one.
The entire system of control relies on the victim believing they are totally alone in the chaos or that, these problems are unique to their relationship. The whole thing starts to crumble the second a connection is made with someone else.
And that connection came from a woman named Megan. She reached out. And she didn't just have a similar story. Her experience with Daniel Martin was, well, it was identical.
It wasn't just vague. It was the same lies, the same intricate, calculated stories. She'd been promised the exact same future, pulled into the same so-called business deals.
The same schemes that Jessica was living through at that very moment.
Now, when you get a jolt like that, proof that your life is a complete facade. The normal reaction is just sheer panic. It's denial. It's an emotional explosion.
Of course.
But the source material is very clear. Jessica did something completely different, something incredibly strategic.
She didn't panic. She didn't explode or rush to confront him.
None of that. The instant she got confirmation that this was a pattern, she moved straight into what we're calling documentation mode.
And this is the first pillar of the survivor blueprint, isn't it?
It is the non-negotiable first step. She understood just instantly that this wasn't an emotional problem that needed an emotional solution. This was a criminal pattern that required evidence, verifiable proof.
That's such a huge mental shift to make in a moment of crisis.
It's the whole game. It's what separates a victim who gets consumed by the chaos from a survivor who is actively, methodically preparing an exit strategy. She basically switched her operating system from, loving partner in a difficult situation to objective investigator collecting data.
So what did that look like?
It meant screenshots, saving every single contradictory text message. It meant meticulously noting every financial inconsistency, every time the numbers just didn't add up. She highlighted timeline overlaps. She compiled this mountain of detailed, verifiable evidence.
And not to confront him with it right away.
No, that's the key. This wasn't for a fight that night. This was leverage for the future.
And as she's doing this privately, this rigorous documentation, the network starts to form on its own.
The first little ripples of what would become the coalition, Other women started to reach out. very quietly, very cautiously.
Why do you think that was? Did they just sense something?
Maybe they sensed a shift in her energy, or maybe they were having their own doubts pile up. But these conversations were all intensely private at first. And when their stories were laid next to Jessica's, they clicked into place. They filled in all the missing pieces of Daniel's narrative.
That privacy you mentioned, that really highlights the shame and confusion these relationships are built on, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The abuser's goal is to make you feel like you're crazy, you're over-emotional, you're the one causing all the problems. But when Jessica took that leap and actually compared notes, the similarities were just uncanny.
So timelines would overlap perfectly.
Perfectly, right? Where he claimed he was, exclusively with her, the emotional abuse tactics, the financial manipulation, it was all a mirror image from one woman to the next.
So the big insight from this phase was realizing she wasn't living a lie that was created just for her.
Exactly. She was living inside a story, a recurring theatrical production that he was staging over and over. And the other victims were they were the previous cast members. She wasn't an isolated target. She was just the next person cast in the role.
For anyone listening who might be in a state of confusion or dealing with gaslighting, this move to documentation seems like the most critical first step.
It is the most vital, actionable thing you can do. It takes the experience from this confusing, subjective, emotional trauma and turns it into objective, legally relevant proof of a pattern. And objectivity is the one thing a narcissist cannot stand. He works relentlessly to destroy it.
So by building that paper trail, she was creating a witness for herself.
An independent, undeniable witness to her own reality, one that can't be manipulated or argued with. And that right there is power.
It's pretty jarring, though, to think that this all started in May 2021, but the relationship, at least publicly, went on for another 3 years.
The psychological endurance that requires is it's extraordinary. You're maintaining this facade while you are internally accelerating toward a complete break.
It's living a dual reality, really.
It's the definition of emotional dissonance management. It requires this intense level of compartmentalization. On the outside, you have the performance, the smiling, happy partner. On the inside, you have the cold, meticulous investigator building a case against that same person.
And the performance was good. If you looked at their social media from 2022 to 2023, you'd see a perfect life. You'd see trips, selfies, happy family moments. The facade was flawless.
But if you look closer, our research showed this subtle shift happening in her captions, starting around 2023. They weren't just random quotes. Looking back, they are clearly what you could call coded distress signals.
Right. She was communicating the pressure she was under without ever naming it.
Exactly. We saw specific examples, things like energy never lies, which is a direct nod to trusting your gut when an abuser is telling you not to, or trust your intuition. That's a mantra for self-validation when you're being lied to every single day.
And then there were the more telling ones, the ones that hinted at the end.
Yes. Outgrowing people you never thought you'd outgrow. And the one that I think really captures the weight of it all was carrying more than people realize.
Chilling, because those captions were her lifeline, in a way. They were how she could acknowledge her own truth, give a voice to that internal dissonance without blowing up the external reality she still felt she needed to maintain.
For her safety, for her kids' welfare, and to continue gathering that crucial evidence. To a casual observer, yeah, they're just motivational posts. But to anyone who's been through that kind of abuse, or maybe even to Daniel himself, they were a sign.
A reflection of an impending reality.
The reality that she was actively documenting the end of a relationship with the person she was still sharing a life with.
And we have to keep reiterating, behind all the smiles and coded messages, the documentation was relentless. The stream of women reaching out it never stopped.
The evidence was piling up, silently, constantly. So she wasn't just surviving the day-to-day psychological battle. She was strategically building an airtight case for the break she knew was inevitable and necessary.
That preparation is the complete opposite of what an abuser wants.
It's their nightmare. They want you exhausted, confused, broken down. Jessica stayed internally focused, objective. It's an exhausting way to live, that dual reality, but it was absolutely essential for building the foundation that would later empower the entire coalition.
So for 2 years, the manipulation was financial chaos, emotional lies, romantic betrayals. But as we get into 2024, it shifts. It becomes something definitive, something incredibly cruel.
Yes. This is the story of Deborah, and this is what provides that final chilling piece of clarity for Jessica.
Why was this the pivot point?
Because it proves, beyond any doubt, that Daniel's pathology wasn't just a series of bad choices. It was an unchangeable pattern that would continue even when he was faced with direct, immediate accountability.
So tell us about Deborah.
Deborah was an older woman. Daniel had convinced her to trust him with her financial future. He persuaded her to give him her life savings, $100,000, with the promise he'd build her a home.
And I think we can guess what happened next.
As is the pattern, a year went by. No house, no progress, no permits, just a mountain of excuses.
But this is where Jessica's character really shows through.
It's an extraordinary moment, despite everything she was going through herself, emotionally, financially. She saw how vulnerable Deborah was, and she decided to fix it.
She used her own money.
Her own money, her own hard-earned resources. She repaid Deborah the full $100,000 to make her whole again. She believed that by doing this, she was closing the book on that chapter of damage and making sure Deborah was safe.
And then comes the twist.
An unbelievable, audacious twist. Just a few weeks after Jessica personally settles that debt, Daniel goes straight back to Deborah.
No.
Yes, he spins a whole new set of intricate stories, leverages whatever trust was left, and he manipulates her out of the exact same $100,000, her entire life savings, for a second time. All of it, completely behind Jessica's back.
The psychological significance of that. I mean, what does that tell Jessica?
It tells her everything. It tells her that Daniel didn't see her act of restitution as a wake-up call or a moment of grace. He saw it as a reset button.
Reset button.
Yes. He realized, okay, the debt is technically cleared, which means Deborah is vulnerable to the exact same con all over again. And this time, Jessica won't be watching. It was the definitive proof. He was incapable of reform and was actively hostile to accountability.
And as this is happening, as he's committing this second theft, the legal system is finally starting to move in the background.
Quietly, yes. Specifically around Deborah's case. And that brings us to June 2024. Jessica and Daniel are actually on a pre-planned couples trip to Cancun with friends, Janine, and her husband.
She still went on the trip.
She had to maintain the facade. But by this point, she has nearly 3 years of meticulous documentation. She has a list of other victims. And the tension on that trip, according to the source material, was just unbearable.
All the classic signs.
All of them. Hiding phones, the dramatic mood swings, the secrecy, the emotional distance. It was all there, even in paradise.
And the dam breaks on the way home.
It does. They're flying back, and they have a layover at Miami International Airport. Jessica, Daniel, and their 2 friends are all together when law enforcement approaches Daniel, and they arrest him right there in the terminal.
The collapse of that facade must have been just immense.
The public shock, the shame, absolutely. But the real emotional earthquake for Jessica was learning why he was arrested. It was directly connected to Deborah, specifically to the second time he stole her life savings, after Jessica had already paid it back.
That's the moment of absolute clarity.
Absolute. There is no more doubt. There is no more hope for change. She paid the ultimate price to restore integrity, and his immediate, unrepentant response was to repeat the exact same predatory act. It confirmed everything the other women had been telling her since 2021.
The relationship had to be over. Right then.
Immediately, and this is where we see that definitive choice in Miami. Even as he's in handcuffs in front of everyone, Daniel tries one last move, one last desperate act of control.
What does he do?
He asked Jessica to stay behind with him. He tried to isolate her from her friends, to get her to stay in Miami and carry his burden, carry his shame, just one more time.
That's the abuser's instinct, isn't it? Isolation.
Always. But this time, Jessica is armed with 3 years of proof and the cold, hard clarity of what he did to Deborah. And she chose self-preservation. She said no. She left him there.
And got on that plane.
That flight home to Tennessee with her friends, it was so much more than just a physical journey. It was a profound, irreversible awakening. It was the absolute, definitive moment she refused to carry his control, his secrets, or his toxic shame ever again.
She was no longer just preparing to break free.
The documenter had become the survivor, and she was free.
So after that moment in Miami, Jessica gets home, and her actions they're very strategic, very intentional.
Yes, the focus immediately goes to fortification. protecting her core foundation, her children, her home, her finances, and prioritizing her own mental health.
It's a shift from reactive survival to proactive rebuilding.
That's a perfect way to put it. Instead of just collapsing into grief or shame, she enters this phase of strategic fortification, which is just essential when you're disentangling from someone so pathologically dishonest.
In her public communication, it changes completely. The coded messages from 2023 are gone.
Totally gone. By late 2024, they're replaced with these direct, powerful declarations. She's reclaiming her sovereignty. The posts aren't about trusting your intuition anymore. They're about claiming victory and clarity.
The language is it's unapologetic.
Very direct. She posted things like, "Even the strongest chains break." And she made these open statements like, "I'm a literal survivor of 5 years of traumatic experiences."
She looked toward the future, too.
Yes, that was crucial. She said, "I'm entering 2025 with the right people in my corner." And that's a public acknowledgement of the survivor network that had been growing in private.
That phrase, the right people, is so important because behind the scenes, the network was still expanding. The documentation was still happening. More women were coming forward.
The foundation was solid. The time for private evidence collection was over. It was time for public exposure, for the detonation.
And that brings us to January 2025. This is when all that private work becomes a public reckoning.
Right. It happens when Jessica tells her story for the first time on a local podcast, raising Barbara Jean and Wanda.
And it's not a huge national show, but that's actually what made it so effective.
It was far more effective. It's a show that is deeply embedded in Middle Tennessee. It has this fiercely loyal local audience, which was the exact group of people who would be most likely to recognize Daniel Martin and his patterns.
And the response was immediate.
It wasn't just a response, it was an explosion. The source material calls it a detonation, and that's accurate. The hosts' inboxes, Jessica's inbox, they just flooded instantly.
With what?
With stories from victims who recognized Daniel, who recognized the pattern of financial abuse and manipulation, and most importantly, they recognized themselves in her story.
And she didn't just stop with one podcast. This is where the coalition really starts to take shape.
It becomes a multi-platform strategy. She's using her personal social media, where new survivors were finding her every single day. She's engaging with local news outlets, which were starting to cover the legal developments.
And she's collaborating with investigative platforms like Jack Diggs Productions.
Yes, which were crucial for amplifying the voices and connecting the wider, more complex dots of the whole story.
That multi-platform approach is strategic genius, really. It stops the abuser from being able to bury the story or discredit one person.
Exactly. It ensures that no matter where a potential victim or a community member is looking for information, a local news report, a podcast, social media, they are going to run into the same irrefutable shared truth.
The impact of that first podcast was so huge, the producers knew they had something much bigger than just one story.
They did. They released a second episode in February 2025, which, as you'd expect, brought even more victims out of the woodwork. It allowed them to align more complex timelines and uncovered even greater financial devastation than anyone knew about.
It creates this viral loop of validation.
It does. Every news story reinforces all the previous ones, and the pattern becomes impossible for anyone to deny. It quickly becomes, as the source material says, a pattern too large to ignore.
And this leads to what you've called the seed moment?
Yes. So after all this, the podcast brings Jessica back for a final closing chapter in June of 2025. And during that recording, the producer pulls her aside and says something that changes everything.
What did she say?
She said, "This isn't just a story. This is a movement. And it needs its own dedicated platform." And that was the spark.
The spark that led to her planning her own podcast.
Her own survivor-centered platform. But it was designed to be much more than just her story. It was about building the future, providing practical education on the mechanics of narcissistic abuse, financial exploitation, trauma recovery, and really the logistics of how to build a successful coalition.
So she wasn't just reclaiming her own narrative anymore.
She is actively building the tools for thousands of other people to go out and reclaim theirs.
So after that initial podcast in January, February 2025 becomes this really pivotal month because Jessica moves beyond just telling her story.
Right, this is the eruption phase. She starts actively deploying the evidence, the hard proof she had been meticulously saving since 2021.
So not just the narrative, but the documentation itself.
The full documentation, stacks of screenshots, proof of his contradictions, the actual financial records, the objective timelines. The private investigation became public, irrefutable evidence.
The power of that release must have been immense.
You can't overstate it because that documentation, it served as objective third-party proof of the pattern. It wasn't he said, she said anymore. It was he said this on this date, but here is the bank record showing this fraudulent transaction on that date. It was fact.
Which validated every single woman who had come forward.
It validated everyone who had been gaslit into doubting their own reality. She was essentially saying, on a massive scale, you are not crazy, and here is the proof that your gut feeling was right all along.
And in that moment, her role shifts.
It does. She transitions from being a victim who survived to becoming the undisputed center of this living, breathing survivor network, a coalition built entirely on verifiable truth and shared undeniable experience.
It's interesting because her documentation validated them, but their stories also reinforced her reality.
It's a feedback loop of validation. Her proof gave them an anchor, and their collective stories, all overlapping, reinforced the truth of her experience. Together, they created this documented collective truth that was just. It was too big to be dismissed as a series of isolated incidents.
And that collective clarity became the foundation of the whole blueprint.
The foundational strengths,
That's right.
exactly.
So, with the public narrative out there, backed by this overwhelming proof and a network of witnesses, the legal consequences were inevitable.
The timeline of accountability was finally catching up to the timeline of the abuse.
That's right. So in May of 2025, Daniel's legal issues, which had been simmering since that arrest in Miami, they escalate.
They escalate significantly, yes. This meant real public-facing consequences were finally materializing.
And Jessica shared his mugshot publicly, but the way she did it was interesting.
It was posted with this striking sense of almost attachment. It wasn't high drama. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was just a matter-of-fact update, part of a continuous chain of public accountability.
Why is that framing so important?
It's deeply important for the healing process, because that legal moment, that wasn't the climax of her story. The climax was her emotional and psychological break in Miami a year earlier.
So this was just confirmation.
It was simply the public record finally catching up to and validating what the survivors had known and documented and been saying for years. It was proof that when you have documentation and unity, external institutions are eventually forced to recognize the truth.
The legal system was just affirming the reality they had already established.
Exactly. The narrative was no longer dependent on the courts. The courts were finally catching up to the narrative.
And that brings us to the summer and fall of 2025, which really marks her ascent from survivor to, well, to leader.
It's a definitive shift. She moves completely past the stage of her own personal healing and into this new role of defining the core principles and the message of the entire movement.
One of the most powerful psychological transitions you can see in trauma recovery, isn't it?
It is. It's the difference between healing from something and actively using that experience as a tool to empower other people. Her public messaging it moved almost entirely away from the pain of the past and toward proactively building an intentional future.
And you could see it in her posts.
Oh, clearly. The themes shifted to these cornerstone ideas: truth, boundaries, peace, self-worth, resilience, empowerment. She was actively modeling the recovered mindset for this rapidly growing network.
And that cemented her role within the coalition.
It did. She became this multifaceted leader for these women. She was a connector, linking people who thought they were alone, a validator, confirming the reality of their trauma, a witness, making sure their stories were taken seriously, and ultimately, a leader, showing them a tangible path forward.
Psychologically, this feels like the final break from the abuser's control.
It's the permanent break. She's no longer shrinking. She's not apologizing for the chaos he created. And most importantly, she is not carrying his shame anymore. The shame was put right back where it belonged on the abuser, and she was, as the source material says, just shining.
And the coalition grows with her.
The collective growth, driven by that positive, forward-facing message, just keeps expanding the pattern recognition. It reinforces the idea that this is not just bad luck. It's systematic, predatory behavior that can be stopped when survivors link arms.
And this brings us to the core of this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
The survivor blueprint itself. The actual roadmap she created.
And this blueprint is just invaluable because it translates all that abstract, confusing, emotional chaos of a toxic relationship into concrete, actionable, replicable steps.
It moves you from that first gut feeling all the way to rising with power.
Exactly.
So let's list them. The first pillar, what she learned right at the beginning, is document early.
Yes. Don't wait until you need it for court. Start collecting objective data the second your intuition whispers that something isn't right.
Which leads right to the next one. Trust your intuition.
That's the only honest signal you have in an environment that is just polluted with lies and gaslighting. You have to listen to it.
And then the strategic turning point. Recognize patterns.
Understanding that your experience isn't unique. You're part of a predictable, recurring cycle that can be identified, tracked, and ultimately exposed.
And the antidote to the abuser's main weapon.
Rectify.
Connect with others. And as part of that, refuse isolation.
Absolutely. The abuser needs secrecy to survive. The survivor blueprint demands visibility, connection, and shared experience.
Then the internal decision that makes the exit possible. Choose yourself.
Your safety, your integrity, your future has to come before the abuser's control, their convenience, or their emotional demands. Period.
And that's followed by the external actions. Speak your truth and build community.
Speaking your truth turns the story into objective reality. Building a community turns that reality into an unstoppable force for change.
And the final outcome of all of this, reclaim your narrative and rise with power.
It's not just about surviving the storm. It's about learning to define your own weather from now on.
So by the end of 2025, Jessica is firmly in this new place of peace and intention. But the movement she started is now much bigger than just her personal journey.
Oh, much bigger. It's become a movement that is unifying survivors across multiple, completely separate, high-profile cases.
And that's the proof that this blueprint works universally.
It is. Her story isn't an outlier. We're seeing this powerful parallel movement against another man, Justin Holder, who's been identified as a completely separate serial narcissistic abuser in the same Murfreesboro community. His case has had local media attention for 10 straight months.
And what's the thread connecting the victim networks of Daniel Martin and Justin Holder?
It's the survivors themselves. It's the women. They are comparing stories, recognizing the exact same manipulative patterns, refusing to be silent, and linking arms across two totally different but functionally identical abuse structures.
It proves the coalition works because of the shared experience, not just because of one police report.
The women are the engine of change. The media platforms, Jack Diggs Productions, the podcasts, local news, they're crucial amplifiers. But the power source, the driving force, is the united shared truth of the survivors.
They're just done carrying shame that was never theirs to begin with.
Exactly. And to have two separate major cases like this unfolding at the same time in the same community, it shows a critical public awakening is happening. The community is learning the signs. The movement is getting louder, more strategic, and more connected every day.
No one is isolated anymore.
Not anymore. And the coalition is no longer just a digital network. For the first time in Murfreesboro's history, this movement has a physical home.
A real, in-person group.
A monthly, in-person survivor group called Rise and Reclaim, surviving and overcoming narcissistic abuse.
Moving from digital to physical, that's a huge step.
It signifies a profound, lasting commitment. It provides a safe physical space for women to lean on each other, share resources, and make sure the energy of this movement outlives the immediate news cycle.
And this empowered community is now focused on systemic change.
Yep.
On legislation.
Yes. Survivors from both the Daniel Martin and Justin Holder cases are now actively pushing for legislative reforms in Tennessee. And these reforms are born directly from the loopholes their shared trauma exposed in the current legal system.
And they're targeting very specific gaps that abusers exploit. The first one is to modernize domestic violence laws to recognize coercive control.
This is so important. Right now, most laws focus on physical harm. But coercive control is that systematic pattern of psychological abuse. The isolation, controlling money, monitoring you, the threats that imprisons a victim without ever leaving a bruise.
So Daniel's financial and emotional manipulation would finally be recognized as the violence it actually is.
Precisely. The second reform is to make orders of protection more accessible and, critically, to use them to prevent violence before it becomes physical.
You could use the documented pattern of abuse to get protection.
Exactly. Think about the Deborah story. The documentation of that level of financial exploitation and manipulation, stealing her life savings twice, that should be enough on its own to trigger legal protections for her, to prevent things from escalating.
Instead of the current system, which often waits for a hospital visit.
The reform argues that documented financial destruction and pathological lying is the precursor to violence, and it requires immediate preventative action.
And the third area is more structural.
It's about modernizing workplace harassment laws. It's designed to stop these types of abusers from using their professional lives as a hunting ground.
Holding employers accountable.
Holding employers accountable who turn a blind eye, ending the culture of silence that protects charismatic abusers, and actually protecting the workers who try to report these patterns.
These aren't just ideas. These are active legislative goals, driven by the real-world experiences of these women.
They are refusing to allow the next generation of victims to fall through the same legal loopholes they did.
This is what elevates the blueprint beyond just a personal recovery plan.
It takes the painful lessons they learned in isolation and applies them to the structures of society. It's about ensuring the path is safer and better protected by law for the next person. That is justice, defined by the survivors themselves.
When you look at this entire series, it really shows what happens when women speak, when they connect, compare notes, and realize the pattern is the same.
When they collectively refuse to carry shame that was never theirs, the entire community wakes up, and change starts to happen.
This whole movement is built on something more powerful than just anger.
It's more than fury. It's driven by clarity, by unity. It's the coordinated movement of justice into the very spaces, the financial systems, the courtrooms, the private relationships, where these toxic patterns used to thrive in silence.
So I think we can deliver the clear, direct statement that this coalition has earned. A statement to narcissistic abusers everywhere who rely on secrecy.
I think we can.
Your time is rapidly running out.
And the reason is simple. Your tactics are known now. Your patterns are being meticulously documented. The blueprint for exposing you is public.
Your victims are finding each other, your communities are watching, and the consequences are coming.
Jessica didn't just walk through hell and come out the other side. She came out holding the map.
And she's handing that map, the survivor blueprint, to every single person who needs it to find their own way out.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you, our listener. Jessica's process, that meticulous documentation, refusing isolation, moving from healing to building a coalition, it's a universal model. It's a way to reclaim control in any confusing or chaotic situation.
So consider this. What personal blueprint could you create by applying those same principles? Documentation, clarity, connection. What could that solve in your own life? Sometimes the map is only found after you commit to drawing it yourself.